She wanted my signature. My son-in-law wanted everything else. And when I said no in front of 200 people, he looked me dead in the eyes and called me a senile old man who didn't deserve what he had built. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw a punch, though God knows my hands were shaking badly enough that I might have missed anyway. I simply set down my glass of water, pushed back my chair, and walked away from the table. The ballroom was still full of people I had known for decades. Clients, partners, old friends who had watched me build something from nothing over 40 years. They all saw it. Every single one of them. That was 3 months ago. A lot has changed since that night. My name is Gerald. I am 63 years old, and until that evening in April, I genuinely believed that the hardest thing I would ever do in my life was bury my wife. Margaret passed 6 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She went fast, which she always said she wanted. Don't let me linger, Gerald. Don't you dare let me linger. She didn't. But the grief did. It has a way of settling into the walls of a house, into the corners of every room, into the passenger seat of a car. You still can't bring yourself to sell because she picked out the color. I had built my company, Hartwell Development, starting with one small commercial property in Columbus, Ohio, when I was 26 years old. No inheritance, no investors. I worked construction summers all through college, saved every dollar I didn't spend on rent and food, and used that money to put a down payment on a failing strip mall that everyone told me was a mistake. 2 years later, I sold it for 3 times what I paid. I took that money and did it again and again. By the time Margaret and I had our daughter Melissa, I had 11 properties and a small but stable development firm. By the time Melissa started college, we had 43. By the time she brought Brandon home for the first time at Thanksgiving, the number was closer to 90. And I had a staff of 31 people who depended on me for their livelihoods. I tell you all of this not to boast. I tell you because you need to understand what I had built and what I was asked to simply hand over. Melissa was 28 when she married Brandon. He was 32, worked in finance, had a good handshake and a louder laugh than I ever trusted. Margaret would have seen through him immediately. She had a gift for that she could sit across from a person for 20 minutes and come away knowing exactly what they were. I never had that. I took people at their word, which is both the reason I succeeded in business and the reason I sometimes failed badly as a father. Brandon was charming. I will give him that much. He remembered details. He knew I liked my coffee black, knew I preferred college football to the NFL, knew which of my early projects I was most proud of. He asked questions and listened to the answers, or at least he performed listening well enough that I couldn't tell the difference. Melissa was happy. She was genuinely, visibly happy in those first years. And after watching her grieve alongside me for her mother, that happiness felt like something I would have done almost anything to protect. So I did what fathers do. I folded Brandon into the family. I brought him into the business gradually, not as an owner, never as an owner, but as a consultant. Someone who could advise on the financial structuring of new acquisitions. I paid him well for that work. Very well. I also helped them with the down payment on their house in Dublin. A 4-bedroom colonial that Melissa had fallen in love with on the first walkthrough. I didn't call it a loan. I called it what it was. A gift from a father to his daughter. I wrote the check without hesitation. What I did not see, or perhaps refused to see, was what that generosity looked like from Brandon's side of the ledger. The anniversary dinner was my idea. 40 years of Hartwell Development I wanted to market properly, not with a press release or a plaque on the wall, but with the people who had been part of it. I booked the grand ballroom at the Meridian Hotel downtown, hired a caterer I'd worked with for 20 years, put together a guest list of about 200 people, clients going back to the 90s, my project managers, my accountants, the woman who had been my assistant for 18 years, old friends, a few neighbors, and family, of course. Melissa and Brandon, my brother and his wife from Pittsburgh, a handful of cousins. The evening started well. Better than well, actually. There is something quietly moving about standing in a room full of people who have watched you work for 4 decades, who have seen the projects go up, and the deals fall through, and the years stack on top of each other like floors of a building. I gave a short speech. I talked about Margaret. I talked about where I started and what it took to get here. I did not cry, but it was close. Dinner was served. The wine came out. The room got louder in the way rooms do, when people are comfortable and well-fed and glad to be somewhere together. I was moving from table to table, the way you do at these things, stopping to talk, shaking hands, laughing at old stories I had heard 100 times but never minded hearing again. I came back to the head table around 9 o'clock. Brandon was already on his third glass of wine. Maybe his fourth, I wasn't keeping count. But I noticed the way he was sitting, slightly too loose in the shoulders, his gestures a little wider than usual. Melissa was talking to my brother's wife and didn't seem to notice. I sat down. Brandon leaned over immediately. That particular lean that people do when they want to seem casual, but have been waiting for the moment. "Gerald," he said, "tonight's the night we need to talk about the transfer documents." I looked at him. "Tonight? I've had the paperwork drawn up. You said you'd think about it. This needs context." 6 weeks before the dinner, Brandon had come to me with a proposal. He wanted me to formally transfer 23 of Hartwell's properties, roughly a quarter of the portfolio by value, into a new LLC that he would manage jointly with Melissa. His reasoning was estate planning. "You're not getting younger," he said, which was both true and delivered in a way that felt like a door being nudged open rather than a courtesy. He said it would reduce my estate tax exposure. He said it would give Melissa financial security. He had documents. He had projections. He had clearly spent a significant amount of time preparing the argument. I told him I would think about it. What I actually did was call my estate attorney, a woman named Carol Benton, who had handled Margaret's estate and whom I trusted completely. I sent her Brandon's documents. Her response came back in 3 days and was not reassuring. So when Brandon raised it at my anniversary dinner, with wine in his glass and 200 people in the room around us, I was not entirely unprepared. In quote, "This isn't the time or place," I said quietly. "You keep saying that." His voice had gone up slightly, not loud enough for the whole table to hear, but loud enough for the 2 people nearest to us to glance over. "You've been saying that for 6 weeks. The accountants need a decision, Gerald. This isn't a casual thing. I know it isn't casual. That's exactly why we are not doing this here. She deserves to be protected." He said it like an accusation. "Melissa deserves security. You keep talking about what you built and who you built it for. But when it comes to actually providing for your own daughter, Brandon," my voice was still low, still even. "Stop." He didn't stop. That was the thing about Brandon that I had misread for years. I had taken his ability to read a room as wisdom, but it was only strategy. When the strategy stopped working, there was nothing underneath it, just pressure. He stood up, not fully, not dramatically, but he rose from his chair enough that the people at the surrounding tables noticed the shift in the air. The conversations closest to us started to thin out, the way conversations do when something is about to happen. "I'm tired of waiting," he said, loudly enough now that there was no pretending it was private. "You've been stringing us along for months. You sit up here and give your speech about legacy and family, and then you won't put a single thing in writing. So I'm asking you directly, in front of everyone who knows you, are you going to take care of your daughter or not?" The ballroom had gone quieter. Not silent, not yet, but quieter. I could feel the attention moving toward our table, the way heat moves toward an open window. I stood up. We were the same height, Brandon and I, but I had 30 years on him, and about 40 years more experience, standing still in a moment that wanted to make you flinch. "Sit down," I said. "Sign the papers, Gerald." I said, "Sit down." He reached across the table not to touch me. Not quite, but to tap the folder that he had apparently brought with him and placed under the table at some point during the evening, which told me this had been planned from the beginning. He put the folder on the tablecloth in front of me. "Sign them tonight," he said, "or explain to everyone here why you won't." I looked at the folder. I looked at him. I looked at Melissa, who had turned around now and was watching with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something closer to a terrible suspense, like someone watching a car approach an intersection and not knowing whether it would stop. I picked up my glass of water. I took a slow sip. I set it down. "No," I said. Then I pushed the folder back across the table, buttoned my jacket, and walked away from the table. I did not go to the lobby. I went to the side corridor near the kitchen exit. A quiet hallway with a service elevator and a row of folding chairs stacked against the wall. My hands were still shaking. My heart was doing something complicated in my chest. I sat there for about 4 minutes, breathing steadily, the way you do when you are trying to convince your body that the emergency is over. Then I took out my phone and called Carol Benton. She answered on the second ring. It was 9:30 on a Friday evening, and she answered on the second ring, which is one of the many reasons I have worked with Carol for 18 years. "Gerald," she said, "is it tonight?" "It happened at dinner. Publicly." A pause. How public? 200 people. Another pause. Shorter. "All right. I'll make some calls. Are you still at the Meridian?" "I'm in the side corridor off the main ballroom." "Stay there. I'm about 25 minutes away." I stayed there. One of the catering staff came through and looked at me with the careful neutrality of someone who has worked enough events to know when not to ask. I asked him for a cup of coffee. He brought it back in 4 minutes. Black. No comment. And I liked him enormously for that. Melissa found me about 10 minutes after I sat down. She came through the corridor door quickly, like she had been looking for a while. She stopped when she saw me. "Dad, sit down, sweetheart." She didn't sit. She stood with her back against the wall, arms crossed over her chest, not defensively, more like she was holding herself together. "He shouldn't have done that," she said. "No, he shouldn't have. He's been under a lot of pressure. The markets have been rough. His portfolio." "Melissa." She stopped. "I love you," I said. "I have loved you every day of your life, and I will love you every day of whatever is left of mine. But I need you to listen to me very carefully right now. What happened out there was not about pressure. It was not about estate planning, and it was not about protecting you." She looked at me for a long moment. Her mother's eyes. She always had her mother's eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Carol is on her way here. She has something you need to see." Carol arrived at 22 minutes, not 25. She came through the main hotel entrance, and the valet pointed her toward the corridor. She was 61, sharp, small, with the kind of presence that makes you feel like the room has been slightly reorganized in her favor. She was carrying a leather portfolio and a look that I recognized from Margaret's estate proceedings, the look of someone who has done the hard work and is now here to deliver it clearly. She shook my hand, nodded at Melissa, and opened the portfolio on the folding table beside us. What she showed us took about 40 minutes to explain, and about 4 seconds to understand at the core level. Over the past 14 months, Brandon had been systematically moving money out of his and Melissa's joint investment account. Not dramatically, not in ways that would trigger an immediate alert, but steadily, and in a pattern that Carol's forensic accountant, whom she had retained 3 weeks ago when she first reviewed his documents, described as methodical. The total was just under $230,000. Some of it had gone to cover losses in a separate trading account that Brandon had never disclosed to Melissa. Some of it had gone to a sports betting platform. Some of it, the trail went quiet on. The LLC transfer proposal, the 23 properties. A quarter of my portfolio was not estate planning. It was a vehicle. Once those assets were in a jointly managed LLC with Brandon as co-manager, he would have had legitimate legal access to leverage them, to borrow against them, to use them as collateral for debts that Melissa did not know existed. He was not trying to protect my daughter. He was trying to use her to cover himself. Melissa sat very still while Carol explained this. She didn't cry. She didn't interrupt. She had her hands flat on her knees, and she looked at the documents with the same focused attention she had given to everything since she was a small girl. Her homework, her mother's illness, her own grief. She was thorough. She always had been. When Carol finished, Melissa looked up at me. "How long have you known?" 3 weeks, I said. "Since Carol called me after I sent her his documents." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed to be certain, and because I needed you to hear it from someone who could prove it, not just from your father who might have had reasons of his own." She was quiet for a moment. "Did you think I wouldn't believe you?" "I thought it wouldn't be fair to ask you to." We stayed in that corridor for a long time. The sounds of the dinner continued on the other side of the wall. Someone was making a toast. There was a wave of laughter. Then the low hum of conversations resuming. My anniversary party continued without me, and I found I didn't mind at all. Brandon came looking for us about an hour in. He pushed open the corridor door with the particular confidence of someone who believes the argument is still winnable, who thinks that if he can just get in the room and start talking, the situation will reorient itself around him the way it usually does. He saw Carol first, then the open portfolio, then Melissa's face. He stopped in the doorway. The confidence went out of him so quickly it was almost physical, like watching air leave something. "Melissa, don't," she said, quietly, completely. He looked at me then. I said nothing. There was nothing I needed to say. Everything that needed to be communicated was in that corridor, already in the documents, in my daughter's voice, in the simple fact of Carol Benton standing there with a portfolio that contained 14 months of his choices laid out in columns and transaction records. Brandon left. He walked back through the door, and I didn't see him again that night. The following weeks were not easy. I want to be honest about that because I think it is important. There is a version of this story where justice arrives cleanly and everyone heals quickly, and the father stands vindicated in a way that feels satisfying and complete. That is not what happened. What happened was that my daughter had to process the fact that the man she had married and loved and built a life with had been lying to her for over a year. She had to go through her financial records and see the shape of what had been taken from her. She had to have conversations with lawyers, and with me, and with her therapist, and, eventually, with Brandon himself. Though those conversations were brief, and I was not present for them, she stayed with me for the first 2 weeks. She slept in her old room, the one that still has the faded outline on the wall where her corkboard used to hang. She ate at my kitchen table, and we watched baseball in the evenings, because she had always loved baseball, and it was something we could do together without having to talk. Margaret had never understood baseball. It was always just the two of us, Melissa and me, explaining it to her with exaggerated patience, and she had always responded with exaggerated incomprehension. And now it was just the two of us again, and the silence where that old joke used to be was something I had learned to sit with, even if it never quite stopped being noticeable. The legal process moved on its own timeline, the way legal processes do. Carol filed the necessary paperwork. The forensic accountant's report was submitted. Brandon retained his own attorney. Melissa filed for divorce about 6 weeks after the dinner, on a Tuesday morning, and called me from the parking lot of the courthouse to tell me it was done. I asked her how she felt. "Like I've been holding my breath for a very long time," she said, "and I can finally stop." I took care of several things on my end during those weeks. I formally restructured my estate documents with Carol, not the way Brandon had proposed, but a careful, protected arrangement that genuinely secures Melissa's future in a way that no one can leverage or access without her full knowledge and consent. I also reviewed every element of Brandon's consulting arrangement with Hartwell Development and terminated it completely, which I should have done years earlier. The contracts were clean. Carol made sure there were no loose ends. I also did something I had been putting off for 6 years. I went through the storage room off the garage where I had put most of Margaret's things after she passed. Not to clear them out. I was not ready for that, and I may not be for a long time yet, but just to open the door and sit with them for a while. There are boxes of her books, her good dishes, wrapped in paper, a folding table covered with her plants that she never got to bring inside that last autumn. I sat in that room on a folding chair for about an hour. I didn't go through anything. I just sat there. It felt like something I owed her, a visit. a quiet acknowledgement that things had changed. The anniversary dinner became a story that people told each other in the weeks afterward. I heard versions of it secondhand, the way you always do, in a city the size of Columbus, where industries overlap, and everyone eventually hears everything. Some versions were accurate. Some had Brandon throwing a glass, which he did not. Some had me delivering some cutting final line before I walked away, which I also did not. I simply stood up and said no and left. That was the whole of it. But that was also the whole of what needed to happen. After 40 years of building something, I had learned slowly, imperfectly, in ways that sometimes cost me that the moments that matter most are rarely the dramatic ones. They are the moments when you see clearly what is in front of you, and you choose not to pretend otherwise. You choose not to sign the papers, because the room is full of people you respect. You choose not to shout back, because your voice shaking is not the same as being wrong. You choose to sit in a corridor and wait for Carol Benton to arrive with the truth, rather than acting on what you already know before you can prove it. Margaret would have seen through Brandon at Thanksgiving, the first time she met him. I have no doubt about that. She would have given me the look she reserved for situations that required patience. A small, specific tilt of her head, eyebrows slightly raised, lips pressed together in a way that meant, "Gerald, pay attention. You are missing something." I would have caught the look and misread it, the way I always did until she explained it to me. That was our arrangement for 31 years. I am still misreading things sometimes, without her there to correct me. I am 63 years old, and I run a development company with 91 properties and 31 employees, and I still get it wrong regularly. But I have learned, finally, to stop when something doesn't feel right. To ask the questions. Instead of accepting the answers I'm given, to call Carol when I have a document that makes my stomach feel off, even if I can't immediately say why. The dinner, as a celebration, was not ruined. I know that sounds like the kind of thing people say to make themselves feel better, but I mean it practically. The speeches happened. The food was good. 200 people came, and most of them had a fine evening. Tom Briggs, who has been my structural engineer on and off for 30 years, told me afterward that it was the best party he had attended since his own retirement dinner, and Tom is not a man who says things he doesn't mean. I did go back into the ballroom that night, after Brandon left the corridor, and after Melissa and Carol and I had talked through the immediate next steps. I went back in through the side door and found my seat and accepted a cup of coffee from the same waiter who had brought it to me in the hallway. He set it down in front of me without a word. And I decided I would find out his name before the night was over and make sure the gratuity reflected how much I had needed that coffee. His name was Daniel. He had been working at the Meridian for 4 years and was finishing a degree in hospitality management at Columbus State. I left a note for the catering manager before I left the hotel, along with a number for a scholarship fund I had set up in Margaret's name 3 years ago. Some things you can't fix. Some things you can. The 40 years are done. The dinner is over. The papers are not signed, and they will not be. Brandon is wherever Brandon goes next, which is not my problem and not my daughter's responsibility to solve. Melissa is meeting me for lunch on Saturday. She suggested it herself, and she suggested a restaurant that she knows I like and that she has never been particularly fond of, which is how I know she is doing it for me, and which is also how I know she is going to be all right. I drove home from that hotel in April, on streets that were still wet from an earlier rain. The kind of wet that reflects the streetlights back at you in long orange lines across the asphalt. The city was quiet. My car smelled faintly of the coffee I had spilled on the console 3 weeks before and had not properly cleaned. The radio was on a station Margaret used to like, not because I had programmed it that way, but because I had never changed it. I drove home to the house where I have lived for 27 years, to the storage room off the garage and the kitchen table, and the bedroom where her reading lamp is still on her side because I never moved it. I parked in the driveway. I sat there for a moment. No, I thought. Not tonight. I got out of the car, went inside, made myself a sandwich, and went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in weeks. I slept deeply and without interruption, which I have not reliably done since April of 6 years ago. Some things, it turns out, are exactly enough.